Maggie, 68 years old, had spent nearly her entire life at Hazelbrook Orchards, an organic apple farm nestled in the lush hills of Pennsylvania. With hands now stiffened by arthritis, she still remembered every motion of kneading sourdough, every early morning spent pruning trees in the mist with her husband Richard. 3 weeks ago, Richard passed away. He was a man of the land, strong and quiet. They had been together since 1981. Together, they built the orchard, the house, and the family with love and diligent hands. But the morning after the funeral, Maggie realized something hard to accept. What they had built might not be enough to hold on to their children. Richard died of pancreatic cancer. 14 months of silent struggle, not wanting the kids to know. "Let them have a little more time without that shadow," he whispered through the pain, voice mingled with morphine. Maggie had agreed. But in truth, she knew the distance in their family had begun long before the illness arrived. Caleb, the eldest son, was a successful financier in Boston, only visiting home a couple of times in over a decade. Lila had failed one wellness project after another, always needing one last sum of money from their father. Maggie had once believed that grief might pull them back to their roots, but when she saw her children step out of the car on the day of the funeral, she didn't see mourners. She saw evaluators. That night, Maggie sat alone in the familiar kitchen at the wooden table Richard used to tap lightly while deep in thought. She suggested that the next day they sort through his belongings, a quiet way to preserve memories. But Caleb and Lila had other plans. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the old lace curtains she and Richard had picked out 30 years ago. Maggie made coffee, the simple kind Richard liked, and waited. When Caleb and Lila came downstairs, they looked like they were headed to an important meeting, not the first morning after their father's funeral. Caleb wore a blazer, hair slicked back. Lila in a light silk blouse, curled hair neatly made up. Their eyes were cold, sharp, calculating. "Mom," Caleb began, setting his coffee cup down with a precision that felt clinical. "We've talked." Lila nodded slightly. "We think it's time to sort things out. The estate, the farm, the house." Maggie paused. "Sort things out? Let's be practical, Mom," Caleb said, voice a blend of gentle and firm. "You can't handle everything on your own anymore. The farm, the property, it's all too much. You're getting older." The word older landed like a sentence on the table. She had once pruned trees in the rain, scrambled to pay wages in bad seasons, baked pies for fundraisers, driven crates of apples to the shelter. Lila chimed in, her tone sugary like a commercial. "There's a really nice senior community 2 hours from here. Sunnyvale Estates. Lots of activities, people your age." Maggie stood to clear the plates. She needed movement to hide her slightly trembling hands. Caleb pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "Dad talked to me about this last year," he said, sliding the papers toward her. She looked down. Caleb's company logo sat neatly in the corner. Richard's signature, bold and clear, looked nothing like the shaky hand of a man on morphine in his final months. "This isn't from the family lawyer," Maggie said, eyes locked on the signature. "He was fully lucid when he signed it," Caleb said quickly. "This is what Dad wanted," Lila added. "A fresh start. There's an investor offering $7 million. You'll be taken care of. We'll be secure." An investor. They plan to sell the entire farm, tear it all down, the land, the trees, a lifetime of farming to build townhouses, pavement, and fake white fences. "You're talking about selling your father's life's work," Maggie said, her voice chillingly calm. "The farm can't last forever, Mom," Caleb replied, voice like steel. Something in Maggie ignited. Not tears, a quiet, stubborn anger. Like the time she yelled at a fox sneaking into the chicken coop. She looked at them, no longer the children she once tucked into bed, but strangers drafting her erasure like she was a problem to be handled. "Show me the will," Maggie said evenly. Caleb hesitated, then pushed the file toward her again. She didn't touch it. "I'm going to my room. We'll talk in the morning." But deep down, Maggie already knew there would be no such conversation tomorrow morning. That night, Maggie didn't sleep. She lay still in the bed she had shared with her husband for over 30 years, listening to the familiar sounds. the creaking wood from the old walls, the wind rustling through the apple rows, the soft thud of the roof each time a stray cat walked across. Everything was still there, the house, the trees, the mountain air, but one thing now felt foreign: the hearts of the children she had given birth to. The next morning, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen, but it wasn't the gentle aroma of Richard's brew. It was the strong, bitter, overpriced kind Caleb brought from Boston, the taste of distance and control. Maggie walked down slowly, not because of age, but because of the weight in her chest. In the kitchen, Caleb and Lila already had their coats on. A suitcase stood by the door, but it wasn't hers. It was one they had helped her pack: a few outfits, medications, and personal items. "We thought we could take you to Sunnyvale today," Lila said, voice bright, as if inviting her to a weekend market. "Just a visit, no pressure." Maggie didn't answer right away. She poured coffee. Her hand did not shake. "No," she said calmly. "I'm not going to a nursing home." Caleb glanced at his watch. "Mom, don't be difficult. It's done. We've signed with the investor. Closing is next week. You can't stay here." "This house is where I've lived my whole life," she said. "It's the home your father built with his own hands." "It belongs to the family," Caleb snapped. "And Dad left us in charge. It's time for you to let go." Maggie looked at her son for a long moment. For the first time, she didn't see the boy who once trailed Richard in the orchard, asking about pollen and morning dew. She saw a man who viewed her as a liability, an elderly problem to be handled. She turned away. "I need to get my medication," she said, "and a few family photos." Lila sighed with relief. "Of course. Take whatever personal items you need. We'll handle the rest later." Maggie went upstairs. No tears fell. In the bathroom, behind a worn mirror installed in the 80s, she removed a small tile behind the medicine cabinet, the place where Richard used to hide valuables. She pulled out a small file: passport, birth certificate, medications, and most importantly, a heavy little metal box. Inside was the original deed to 20 acres of land under the name Maggie Grace, dated before her marriage to Richard. That plot, tucked on the eastern edge of the orchard, seemed insignificant, but it held the most precious thing: the only natural water source of the entire Hazelbrook orchards. No water, no irrigation. No irrigation, no orchard. No orchard, no investor value. It was a safeguard Richard once mentioned: in case tomorrow isn't like today. Maggie had laughed back then, but now she knew he'd been right. She walked downstairs, her purse now heavier, but her heart lighter, clearer. "Ready, Mom?" Caleb asked. Maggie gave a faint smile. "Yes." She let Lila take her arm as they walked to the car, back straight, gaze steady. The car pulled away from Hazelbrook, past blooming apple trees, past the elementary school where Maggie once read books to children, past the town library where she taught gardening classes. But instead of merging onto the highway as promised, Caleb turned onto a deserted dirt road. 20 minutes later, they stopped at an empty field. "Get out, Mom," Caleb said, his tone flat, like instructing a driver to pull over. Lila gasped. "Caleb, what are you doing?" "She's going to make trouble," Caleb said. "She'll sue. She'll ruin things. Just leave her here. She's got meds, clothes. There's a gas station 5 miles from here. She'll manage." He opened the door, and then they drove off, leaving a 68-year-old woman at the edge of a gravel road beside the small suitcase they had packed for her. Or at least, they thought they left her. The car disappeared in a cloud of dust, but Maggie didn't cry. She didn't scream. She stood still in the wind, hand clutching her purse, no longer afraid. Because now, she was no longer the mother left behind. She was the woman who held what they didn't know existed. She began to walk, not toward the gas station Caleb had mentioned, but toward town, toward the beginning of a quiet but unyielding fight back. After nearly 2 hours of walking, her feet blistered and throbbing, Maggie reached the outskirts of Hazelbrook. The sun was higher now, warming the back of her neck. Her dress was dusty, her shoes smeared with gravel and dirt, but every step she took had purpose. Each step was a quiet declaration. I'm still standing, and I'm not done yet. Ahead stood a small building with a faded sign, Miller's Gas Grocery, an old familiar place where people still called each other by name and paid in cash. Maggie sat on the wooden bench outside the store, placing her suitcase beside her. To the casual eye, she was just a tired old woman resting by the roadside. But in the handbag on her lap, she carried something far weightier than any apology her children had never given: the truth. Joe, the store owner, stepped out from behind the counter, apron tinged with the smell of soap. "Mrs. Whitmore?" He frowned. "You all right? You look a little pale." "Just resting a bit, Joe. It's been a long day," Maggie replied. Joe glanced at the suitcase, then back at her, eyes filled with genuine concern. "I'm really sorry about Mr. Richard. He was a good man." "He was," Maggie nodded gently. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Need to make a call? If you don't mind using the back office." Maggie nodded. "Thank you, Joe." He led her past shelves lined with dusty canned goods and discounted cereal boxes into a small room behind the shop. A landline phone, lightly covered in dust, rested on the wooden desk. Maggie picked up the receiver and dialed from memory. The line clicked after just one ring. A man's voice, clear and surprised, answered. "Naomi, I've been calling you. Why weren't you at the will reading?" "Harold." Maggie gripped the receiver. "I didn't even know there was one." Silence. "Caleb brought a will. But I have doubts. The signature is too clean, too perfect, nothing like Richard's handwriting in his final months." "Harold," Maggie said firmly, "I need your help, and I need you to keep it confidential." "You have both," Harold replied. "My office. 1 hour." Maggie hung up. "Joe, do you still sell prepaid phones?" "Sure do. You need one?" "Yes, and a bottle of water." Joe grabbed both and handed them over without charging. "It's on me. If you need anything else, just say so." That kindness nearly broke Maggie, but she hadn't cried at Richard's funeral, and she wouldn't cry now. She had work to do, and she was far from done. Harold's law office sat on the second floor of an old building along Main Street, just across from the town library. Harold was the kind of man who still wore sweater vests without irony and believed in the weight of a firm handshake. His secretary, Denise, raised her eyebrows when she saw Maggie enter dusty clothes, suitcase trailing behind. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Jennings is expecting you. Can I get you water or coffee?" "No, thank you," Maggie replied. Harold stepped out, silver hair a little tousled, but eyes still sharp, just like the last time he and Richard had met. "Maggie," he said, and instead of leading her to his desk, gestured toward 2 leather chairs by the window. She sat straight-backed, looking him in the eye. "I'll tell you everything, every detail." And she did. From the cold funeral to the breakfast filled with blade-sharp words. From the folder with the forged signature to the detour and abandonment in the field. Every detail, she spoke slowly, without trembling. Harold didn't interrupt, just nodded, his face growing darker with each moment. When she finished, Maggie opened her bag and took out the metal box. She lifted the lid and pulled out the original deed for 20 acres of land in the name of Maggie Grace, including water rights. Harold held the paper with both hands, eyes quiet for a moment. This isn't just land, Maggie. This is leverage. With the water rights and zoning, no developer can move forward without this." "I know." Harold leaned back, tapping the file's edge. "That will Caleb brought. It's fake. I suspected it from the start. The signature's too perfect Richard could barely hold a pen near the end. We'll contest it, but that takes time. For now..." He lifted the deed and the map. "We use this. That parcel is still in your name. They can't finalize any sale without your consent." Maggie nodded. "I want my house back, and I want them to understand what they've done." Harold looked at her, emotion flickering across his face for the first time. "Then let's make them understand." The next day, Harold filed an emergency injunction with the county court, freezing all transactions related to Hazelbrook Orchards. A courier delivered the legal notice straight to the real estate firm that had signed with Caleb and Lila. Within hours, the deal was put on hold. The developers began to panic when they discovered the only natural water source of the entire orchard was owned by someone else and hadn't been disclosed in the original agreement. Their attorney called Harold desperate. "I told them the truth," Harold recounted later. "That land isn't Caleb's or Lila's, and more importantly, they have no legal authority, despite what they claim." Maggie sat silently, hands folded. Outside the window, the town moved on like any other day. Children rode bikes on the sidewalk. A dog barked in someone's yard. Somewhere, a lawnmower buzzed. She said nothing in return. She didn't need to, because the first move in her quiet retaliation had succeeded. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen window of the small apartment Maggie had just rented on Hazelbrook's Main Street. She poured coffee into an old ceramic mug, the one Lila had given her on her 13th birthday, with the words, "World's Best Mom," now almost entirely faded from time and dish soap. The phone buzzed. 19 missed calls, 7 text messages, 3 voicemails. She didn't open a single one. Not because she was angry, but because, for the first time in years, Maggie was learning to stay with her own feelings instead of rushing off to fix someone else's. Yesterday afternoon, Harold had confirmed the court approved the transaction freeze. The developers had halted all plans. They were calling, panicked. And at the same time, her children Caleb and Lila were unraveling too. 9:04 a.m. First message from Lila. "Mom, Grant and his parents are very disappointed. They say I'm not strong enough to set boundaries. I know I didn't mean to hurt you, but everything's a mess now. Can you help me?" Not a word of apology. Not once did she mention leaving her mother on the side of the road. Only panic because the deal was falling apart. Maggie sipped her coffee. Bitter, just right. She set the phone down and went back to watering the plants on her tiny balcony. A young basil plant was just beginning to root. That afternoon, Harold received a direct call from Caleb. His voice was tight, demanding clarity, pushing to resolve misunderstandings. But when Harold stated clearly, "From now on, all communication goes through legal counsel," Caleb fell silent. "They're starting to realize," Harold said when he met with Maggie later that day. "They thought you had nothing left." Maggie nodded. "But I still have everything they never knew how to value." Harold looked at her, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "You've handled this with grace. Most people would have scorched the earth. You didn't." "I've lived my whole life with kindness in my bones," Maggie replied. "But kindness doesn't mean silence. Not anymore." Late that evening, she sat on the plain wooden chair out on the balcony. Below her, the streetlights glowed a soft amber. Everything here was small, the apartment, the garden corner, the life, but each thing was hers, by choice. Not Richard's. Not the Wills. Not a reluctant forgiveness, but hers alone. The apartment was just above Hazelbrook's bakery. Each morning, the smell of warm butter and cinnamon filled the air. At noon, children ran past in giggling packs. In the afternoon, sunlight slanted through the window, lighting up the white lace doily Maggie had embroidered herself. This wasn't the home she and Richard had built together, but it was a home in a different way, a place no one could take from her. On Saturday, Maggie visited the town's community center. The old rec room still had its bulletin board plastered with pale pink sticky notes. A group of older women were arranging chairs, preparing for a sewing class. "Mrs. Whitmore," one called out. "You still teaching?" Maggie smiled. "If you haven't forgotten me yet, then yes." They laughed. And so, every Wednesday evening, Maggie returned not as a mother, a wife, or a landowner, but simply as herself. A woman who knew how to stitch a seam right, who remembered how to plant fruit trees without chemicals, who had more stories than people expected. At the town library, she started a weekend class on sustainable farming. The group was small but packed. Curious teenagers, young couples hoping to leave the city life behind, and even older folks like her, searching for purpose in their later years. No one came because she was rich. No one came because she was famous. They came because she understood the land, understood people, understood silence. They came because in Maggie's trembling hands lived the true history of the town. One afternoon, Harold walked into the library and handed her a folder. "Are you ready?" he asked. Maggie opened the papers. It was a water rights donation transferring usage of the land's only water source to the Hazelbrook Agricultural Cooperative, a group supporting young farmers and organic agriculture in the region. "Now, that land isn't just mine," she said. "It belongs to people who know how to love it." Harold nodded. "They won't be able to sell the farm now," he confirmed. "The developer pulled out, and the forged will is under court suspension." Maggie didn't smile. She didn't need to. Because in her heart, something more important had ended, the anger. And in its place, something else had taken root, freedom. The following days passed gently. No more urgent voicemails, no more pleading texts. Caleb and Lila had vanished, no more managerial tones, no more disguised advice, no more strained smiles when they wanted something. Maggie didn't reach out, nor did she wait for them to return. In the late afternoons, when sunlight slanted across the stone walkway of Hazelbrook's town square, she sat quietly on an old wooden bench beside the bakery, watching life go on. The town was still the same: strawberry sellers, leaf sweepers, the jingle of bicycle bells, and children calling to each other in the schoolyard. No one knew Maggie had almost lost everything. No one knew she had been left on the side of the road like a burden. And no one needed to know. Because now she no longer needed others to validate her pain. She had already acknowledged it to herself. One morning, she stopped by the edge of the old orchard. The wooden fence was still intact. The apple branches were blooming with soft white blossoms. The wind carried a sweet scent through the air. She stood there for a long while, her hand resting on the rough wooden rail Richard had once hammered in himself. The ache wasn't sharp, just a long breath that carried the image of a silver-haired man, pruning shears in hand, whistling a nameless tune. "I think you were right after all," she whispered. "Preparing for the worst isn't fear. It's love knowing what something is truly worth." She didn't go in, just stood there, like an old neighbor passing by, then quietly turned away. A few weeks later, Maggie was invited as a guest speaker for a town library forum. The topic: independent women in their later years. No microphone, no spotlight. Just a circle of plain wooden chairs, faces old and young, packed into a room filled with the smell of old paper and sunlit dust. When her turn came, Maggie didn't speak right away. She looked around the room, then gave a gentle nod. "I used to think I was weak," she began, "because I didn't get angry. I didn't scream when I was betrayed. I didn't demand justice out loud. I just got up and kept walking." A young woman at the back of the room sat up straighter. An older man nodded slowly. "And then I realized," Maggie continued, "silence isn't weakness. It's only weak when we use it to hide. But when we use it to see clearly, to choose, it becomes strength." She shared her story, not in detail, not with names, but everyone understood. She had once been pushed out of her own life. And she had chosen not to fight for the old seat, but to pull up a new one of her own. That day, after the conversation ended, a group of young people approached Maggie. They said they wanted to start a small farm just outside Hazelbrook, grow strawberries, raise bees, and protect clean soil. "We heard you know how to restore land without chemicals," one of them said. Maggie smiled. "I don't know everything, but I know how to listen to the land." A few days later, she officially became the unpaid technical advisor for Farm to Hazel, a new initiative to revive sustainable farming in the surrounding hills. The water rights transfer was complete. Hazelbrook Orchard's most vital resource now belonged to the agricultural cooperative, no longer for sale, no longer transferable, available only for community use. Maggie didn't keep it for herself, but she did draw a permanent line. This land would never become concrete neighborhoods the way others had once planned. One afternoon, Harold stopped by the bakery. "News," he said. "The developers fully pulled out. The project's scrapped. The forged will is under investigation. And Caleb and Lila? Maggie asked. They're silent. Word is, both were flagged in investor circles. Reputations damaged. But no one's apologized. Maggie nodded. Not sad, not surprised. No need. I don't live waiting for their apology. I live knowing who I am. Harold smiled softly, saying nothing more. That evening, Maggie stood by her apartment window, looking out. Below, the streetlights glowed dimly golden. A soft breeze carried the lingering scent of sweet pastries from the bakery downstairs. Somewhere, a young couple argued over a leaky faucet. An old woman pushed a cart home late. A boy rode his bicycle in lazy loops. Life went on, no applause, no recognition. But every time Maggie passed the old orchard fence and saw the apple blossoms still blooming, she smiled. Not a smile of triumph, but the smile of someone who had refused to be erased from her own story. Each time Maggie passed Hazelbrook Orchards, the place that had once been her home, her garden, her everything, she didn't turn her head. She didn't need to look to know. The apple trees were still there. The roots still ran deep. The seeds she'd planted were still growing, not to be sold off, but to live rightly. No one talked about selling anymore. No one mentioned development potential. The town had fallen quiet again, the way it always did after a storm had passed. Caleb and Lila never came back. Maggie never called them either. She understood now. Some wounds don't require a blade, and some distances don't need shouting to become permanent. One evening, Maggie sat out on her small balcony, the old wooden chair, the basil plant finally taking root, and the quiet sky stretched above the rooftops. She thought of that day on the dirt road, the suitcase she hadn't packed, the medications, the clothes, and the assumption that she would stay silent. She hadn't cried then, and now, looking back, she felt no regret, because in that loneliest moment, she'd heard something she had ignored for years. Being a mother does not mean accepting betrayal, and love does not mean never being allowed to be angry. Caleb and Lila had believed Maggie wouldn't fight back because she was old, a widow, not tech-savvy, too weak to take legal action. They forgot. Before she was their mother, she was Maggie Grace, a woman who had bought her first piece of land with her own modest paycheck. A woman who planted trees no one believed would grow. A woman who once shouted down the town council for trying to cut an old oak tree. They thought she was weak. In truth, she had simply been quiet because she believed people would stop before going too far. But when they didn't stop, she didn't stay still either. If there's anyone at all who's ever been pushed out of their own story, Maggie hoped they'd hear this. Your strength isn't in how loud you shout. It's in knowing exactly what you stand for. And once you stand firmly, even in silence, that echo can be louder than any betrayal. The orchard still stood. The water still flowed. Her name was still on the deed. And it had returned to the stories people began to tell about her. No one can erase your name unless you erase it yourself. One afternoon, while Maggie was showing a young couple how to check soil pH, the young husband turned and asked, "Did you ever lose everything?" Maggie smiled. "I thought I had." "And how did you get it back?" She glanced toward the far end of the garden, where young apple trees had just been grafted. "By never letting anyone pack my bags again."